Uganda entered the standard gauge railway project with a fundamentally different motivation than Kenya or Tanzania. It had no port, no direct access to the ocean, and no ability to control its foreign trade on its own terms. Its economy was effectively captive to transit corridors running through neighboring states. That is precisely why the railway, for Kampala, was framed as an instrument of economic emancipation. Officially, the story was about linking Kampala to the Kenyan border at Malaba and onward to the port of Mombasa. There were visions of modern stations, fast passenger services, and regional integration, the familiar language of progress. Yet planning documents and corridor conversations revealed a different priority entirely. Uganda was not building a railway for commuting. It was building it for oil, minerals, and regional transit. The discovery of oil deposits in the Albertine Graben altered the infrastructure imagination from the ground up. The railway stopped being a transport project and became a component of an energy system. The tracks were meant to serve the extractive hinterland, moving equipment, inputs, semi-processed goods, and ultimately feeding an export stream. Passengers existed in the narrative, but they were never at the center of the design. When Uganda signed preliminary agreements with Chinese infrastructure firms to build its own SGR segment, the rhetoric sounded almost identical to Kenya's: modernization, development, regional connectivity. Yet the financing was never fully closed. The project sank into negotiation cycles, and implementation was delayed again and again. The delay did not mean the logic disappeared. Uganda began to be pulled into the regional railway order even without its own SGR tracks. Its economy was planned around future transit. Roads, logistics centers, and industrial zones started to appear in places meant to serve a corridor that did not yet exist. The state was preparing for a railway still on paper, a railway that nonetheless already shaped investment decisions in the real world. Then another variable entered the equation. Tanzania began building its own SGR corridor to Dar es Salaam. For Uganda, this opened an alternative route for exporting oil and goods. Suddenly, Kampala was no longer interested only in the Kenyan direction. It started balancing between two oceanic exits, not to move people, but to secure better terms for export. At that moment, the railway became a negotiating instrument. Uganda had no tracks, but it had resources and a potential transit volume, bargaining chips vis-a-vis Kenya, Tanzania, and foreign investors. Every discussion about SGR was, in reality, a discussion about who would control the future stream of export revenues. For society, this was a nearly invisible process. People heard about a railway that was coming, but for years they saw only trucks, traffic jams, and broken roads. The railway existed in strategies, presentations, and agreements, but not in everyday life. Frustration grew, along with the sense that mega infrastructure projects had drifted away from the practical needs of citizens. In practice, Uganda was being prepared for the role of an export and transit node rather than a center of social mobility. Its future railway was designed to serve oil, regional trade, and the movement of goods from the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. Passengers were an accessory in the narrative, not its foundation. For China, Uganda was a piece of a larger puzzle. It did not need a spectacular national line in order to be absorbed into the system. It was enough that it could be connected to the Kenyan and Tanzanian logistics corridors. Control over technical standards, financing architecture, and port-related infrastructure in the region translated into indirect influence over Uganda's future trade. And here, the full logic of the model becomes visible. You do not need to build a railway in every country to bring it into the system. You only need to design a map in which states become nodes of flow rather than authors of direction. Uganda landed precisely there, between Kenya and Tanzania, between oil and ports, between the promise of development and the reality of serving as a transit hinterland. That is why its story is one of the most symbolic chapters of the entire SGR saga. It shows that even the absence of tracks does not protect a country from being pulled into a global system of infrastructural dependency. Rwanda, by contrast, never had the ambition to build a vast national railway. The country is small, densely populated, and landlocked. After the trauma of the 1990s genocide, the priority became stability, centralized governance, and rapid reconstruction of the economic basics. Infrastructure mattered, but not as a monumental rail megaproject. Rwanda chose roads, inland logistics, and disciplined management of commodity flows. Yet when standard gauge railway entered the region, Kigali discovered that not having tracks did not equal neutrality. If anything, it created a different kind of exposure. Rwanda was drawn into the system as the end customer of export corridors built by neighbors. Two directions mattered. One ran through Kenya to the port of Mombasa, the other ran through Tanzania to Dar es Salaam. Both ports were being integrated into new rail lines designed to carry the bulk of regional trade. Rwanda thus found itself in a position where imports and exports became dependent on infrastructure built beyond its borders. In Kigali, no tracks were laid, but something else was built. Logistics centers, dry ports, and transfer nodes emerged to integrate the country into regional transport corridors. The key symbol of this strategy became the Kigali Logistics Platform, a dry port designed as a container consolidation point from which goods could be moved by truck to rail terminals in Tanzania or Kenya. This was a logistics model of a new generation. Rwanda was not investing in a railway. It was investing in access to other people's railways. In practice, that meant the country avoided the cost of building tracks, but it absorbed the consequences of the system. Every change in port tariffs in Dar es Salaam, every operational decision at Kenya's inland container depots, every border delay hit Rwanda directly. Rwanda became hostage to external infrastructure even while maintaining fiscal caution at home. At the same time, Kigali tried to turn this exposure into strategy. The government presented Rwanda as a neutral regional hub, a stable intermediary state connecting East Africa with the Great Lakes region. But that role came with a structural limitation. The country became a manager of flows rather than a producer of value. Logistics gained priority over industrial deepening. The model had advantages. Rwanda avoided the debt burdens that weighed down Kenya and, in other corridors, Ethiopia. It retained greater fiscal flexibility, but it paid another price: diminished control over a core element of economic sovereignty, independent export infrastructure. For China, Rwanda was a convenient piece on the board. There was no need to build tracks in Kigali for the country to be integrated into the system. It was enough to shape technical and logistical standards in neighboring corridors. By relying on SGR-linked routes in Kenya and Tanzania, Rwanda was automatically folded into the region's Chinese-designed trade architecture. This created a sharp paradox. Rwanda was among the region's most centralized and disciplined states. Yet in foreign trade logistics, it became more dependent on decisions made in Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, and Beijing than on decisions made by its own institutions. Socially, the process was less visible than in Kenya or Ethiopia. There were no spectacular protests against rail lines because the rail line was not physically present, but among entrepreneurs and importers, a growing sense took hold. Logistics costs were imposed from the outside, and Rwanda had little real negotiating power against the operators of regional corridors. Rwanda thus became the most subtle case study of a new type of infrastructural dependency, not through building tracks, but through lacking them. Not through railway debt, but through reliance on other people's nodes. Not through spectacular investment, but through logistical subordination. And this is why Rwanda completes the map of our SGR episode. It shows that in the 21st century, you do not need to occupy territory or seize state institutions to build influence. You can design a transport system in which some states own tracks, others own ports, and the rest must connect to them if they want to function in the global economy. On Beijing's investment maps, Africa does not appear as a collection of states. It appears as one vast resource space, cut through by logistics corridors running from the continent's interior to its oceans. As the SGR system began stabilizing in East Africa, another ambition entered the Chinese imagination. Larger than connecting one port to one hinterland, China began speaking explicitly and implicitly in the language of a rail bridge between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. This was not a single project, a single line, or a single agreement. It was a concept, a continuous transport belt linking Africa's western coastline to its eastern flank, creating an intracontinental trade corridor independent of traditional maritime routes. In this vision, Atlantic ports, in Angola, in the Congos, across the Gulf of Guinea, would be connected to East African ports. Goods, minerals, and semi-processed materials could move overland through the center of the continent without ships having to sail around Africa. For China, this would mean more than shorter routes. It would mean control over Africa's logistical spine. The idea did not emerge in a vacuum. For years, Beijing had been assembling fragments of this puzzle. In southern and central Africa, rail investments were linked to copper, cobalt, and rare earth supply chains. In East Africa, SGR lines were tied to Indian Ocean ports. In West Africa, ports and transshipment nodes were upgraded and modernized. Each project was officially local. Together, they began forming a continental web of dependence. Strategically, such a corridor would matter enormously. Africa is not only a resource storehouse, it is also transit space between Asia, Europe, and South America. An east-west link would offer alternatives to maritime choke points, the Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and other sensitive routes monitored by Western naval power. A land corridor across Africa would be a southern analog to the Belt and Road, not through Eurasia, but through a continent that is becoming one of the world's primary reservoirs of strategic materials. In Central Africa, discussions intensified around rail lines linking the extractive zones of the Democratic Republic of Congo to Atlantic ports. In parallel, planners analyzed the possibility of connecting those routes to eastern corridors leading toward Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia. On the maps of strategists, new lines appeared across savannas, jungles, and mountains that only a decade earlier had been written off as too difficult for modern infrastructure. Officially, this was framed as continental integration. Documents spoke about interregional trade, African development, strengthened economic links. In practice, it resembled a blueprint for a land-based commodity superhighway, designed to move minerals, metals, and energy quickly between two oceans. For African states, the vision was tempting. It promised investment, jobs, and infrastructure on a scale the continent had never seen. For China, it was even more attractive. It implied that control over ports, tracks, and terminals would no longer be local or merely regional. It would become continental, but the political consequences would be vast. An Atlantic-Indian corridor would turn mid-continent states into new nodes of logistical power. Countries long treated as peripheral could suddenly find themselves on major trade routes. At the same time, it would mean that decisions about infrastructure in one region would ripple across thousands of kilometers. In that sense, a Trans-African Railway is not a technical project. It is a top-tier geopolitical project. Because if a continuous corridor could be built from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, Africa would stop appearing as scattered extractive backyards. It would become one transport system, and the rhythm of that system would be dictated by those who control the infrastructure. And that is where the real question of this story emerges. Will Africa use this vision to build its own economic autonomy, or will it become the backbone of someone else's logistical empire? Because if tracks connect both oceans, the question will no longer be merely where trains go. It will be who decides what travels on them. For a long time, the West watched China's infrastructure expansion in Africa with a mixture of dismissal and helplessness. Rail, port, and energy projects were treated as exotic initiatives of a distant power, unlikely to shift the global balance. But as Africa's map filled with new logistics corridors and regional economies became increasingly tied to infrastructure built to Chinese standards, the narrative changed. In Brussels, Washington, and European capitals, a realization crystallized: this was not a race for construction projects. It was a race for control over flows. The European Union responded with its own infrastructure strategy, branded as Global Gateway, officially grounded in transparency, environmental standards, and local employment. In reality, it was an attempt to build an alternative to China's Belt and Road model and to reclaim influence in spaces where Beijing had dominated for a decade. In parallel, the United States began shaping its own infrastructure alliances, often in coordination with European partners and Western financial institutions. At the center of this countermove stood a project designed to become the emblem of a Western return: the Lobito Corridor. The Lobito Corridor is a rail and port route running from the Atlantic port of Lobito in Angola through the Democratic Republic of Congo toward Zambia. Officially, it is meant to improve regional trade and enable exports of resources from the continent's interior. Unofficially, the logic is larger. It is a strategic attempt to break China's logistical dominance by creating an alternative export route outside Beijing's orbit. This was more than a railway investment. It was a political message. It signaled that the West was returning to Africa not with humanitarian aid, but with strategic infrastructure, returning to compete over what actually shapes the region's geopolitical position, the routes through which minerals and goods move. Central and Southern Africa entered a new phase of competition. States began receiving parallel offers. On one side, Chinese credit and fast execution. On the other, Western investment packages promising greater transparency but demanding institutional and political reforms. For African governments, this was both opportunity and risk. They gained choice. They could negotiate. They could play investors against each other. Yet they also found themselves at the center of a new infrastructure Cold War, where each railway project, each port, each terminal became a component of global strategy. In East Africa, the tension was particularly visible. A region previously dominated by Chinese rail investment began attracting Western counterproposals. Plans for port modernization, border digitalization, logistics upgrades, and alternative corridors entered EU documents and the agendas of American development programs. This was not charity. It was influence reconstruction. The West understood it did not need to outbuild China mile for mile. It only needed to secure key nodes, ports, mineral terminals, junction points where continental corridors intersect. Control over a handful of strategic points can translate into influence over an entire system. In response, China did not retreat. It adjusted. It reduced exposure to high-risk projects, renegotiated terms, reinforced its presence in ports and energy assets. The infrastructure contest moved into a subtler phase, less spectacular, but more advanced. Africa became a board where pieces move not with tanks, but with contracts, not with bombs, but with loans, not with occupation, but with rail lines. And at this point, the story enters its most unsettling stage, because when two power blocks compete over the infrastructure of one continent, the stake is not only economic development. The stake is who will steer the future trade architecture of the world. And Africa, once again in history, is at the center of the game, not as spectator, as battleground. The train moves slowly, heavily, as if the entire continent were pulling it from behind. First the ground vibrates under the wheels, then the air and the horizon begin to tremble, and finally the silence itself shifts. Because in places where there used to be only dust and acacia trees, a sound arrives that does not leave. Steel striking steel. A rhythm that does not recognize national borders, bureaucratic languages, or tribal histories. It recognizes only direction. The driver does not think in terms of empires. He thinks in signals, speed, and timetable. But what guides his train was designed thousands of kilometers away, in conference rooms where Africa's map lies flat on glass tables, where rail lines are drawn like arrows in a strategic board game. Those maps do not show villages, markets, children playing near the tracks. They show only flows, raw materials, volumes, indicators. Africa has always been described by the world as a space of potential, a future that has not yet arrived. But now the future is being built out of concrete, steel, and infrastructure loans. It takes the shape of tracks cutting through savannas, jungles, and cities without asking permission, because the decisions were made elsewhere, long before. When the first train entered the new lines, people came out of their homes, they took photos, they waved. For many, it felt like the world had finally reached them, that modernity was no longer something watched on a phone screen, but something passing through their neighborhood. Then the routine arrived. The freight trains began running at night, long, heavy, less cinematic, more merciless in their regularity. And that is when the underlying truth became visible. This railway was not built so people could travel faster. It was built so wealth could leave the continent faster. Containers do not remember colonial history. Metal ore does not care about borders drawn with rulers. Gas and oil do not ask whether the country they pass through has strong institutions or only a flag and anthem. They move toward the port. And ports are increasingly embedded in global control systems whose center lies far outside Africa. This is the moment when steel begins to remember. It remembers politicians signing agreements under the pressure of development. It remembers bankers calculating risk while ignoring social consequence. It remembers engineers building to schedule without asking who would own the flow that would later run through these lines. Because infrastructure is not neutral. It encodes the future. It decides where cities will grow, where jobs will cluster, where capital will accumulate, and where only transit will remain. It determines who will export value-added goods and who will remain a supplier of raw materials. Africa has reached a moment that future historians will call a turning point. Either it becomes a continent that uses infrastructure to build its own industry, its own technologies, its own centers of decision-making, or it remains a map of corridors through which the world passes on its way to resources. The most brutal element of this story is that none of it looks like violence. There are no tanks, no air raids, no ruins. There is asphalt, concrete, new stations, progress that photographs well, development that looks clean on PowerPoint slides, and yet the consequences are as durable as conquest. Once a logistics system is designed, it cannot be reversed easily. Tracks do not change direction overnight. Ports do not stop servicing contracts because a government changes. Infrastructure agreements outlive political terms. And that is why children falling asleep today to the sound of passing trains will wake tomorrow inside a world already designed for them. They will work in economies plugged into global corridors. They will vote in states forced to negotiate not only with neighbors, but with entire infrastructure systems. This is a new world order, not built on political maps, but on logistics maps. And somewhere between one container and the next, between one train run and another, a question unfolds that no station sign will ever display. Will Africa ride these tracks as the owner of direction, or merely as scenery outside the window of someone else's journey?